understand much more now the need for counter-cyclical policy than they did in the past. So even emerging markets, emerging countries or transition economies, already they can do much better there. And then you have the very poor countries there where you have to, but there, you know, volatility is not that big there not always, and there where you can have IFIs playing a role in addition to the other things. But we should not underestimate the margins you can gain on all the covariates I mentioned, those I showed and those I mentioned during the lecture. For example, South Africa we're discussing, or emerging countries of that kind. Yeah. Alors, we control for sector fixed effect in the regression. Huh? So if there are differences on sectors, and we looked at but asset tangibility, you know, asset tangibility is a pretty good measure. So you would say, you know, low asset tangibility, they are low asset tangibility because they are more cyclical. You see what I mean? When you use asset tangibility as a measure. When you use financial dependence, you could argue maybe that volatility has to do with it. When you use things like asset tangibility, or like some measures I used for the inventory to sales ratio, it's less obvious, you know, that it's because it's more volatile that it's more subject to the constraint. Yeah, in those cases. Yeah, in fact, yeah. See, real estate, for example, is a high asset tangibility and is very volatile. So I don't think actually that that's the case. Yeah. Yes.
The capital decision of the firm. That is to say, whether to try to be counter-cyclical in terms of, I don't know, taxation on debt equity or all of this, in order to be more selective.
Yeah, to push. Yeah. So there is this whole debate. I mean, the kind of things government can do, there are two kinds. Of course, there is the preferential tax treatment on debt. And for example, Admati and Helvig criticized this preferential. And so to which extent, by not having that, you would, you know, what would be the effect? So you would kind of discourage leveraging by firms. So is that a good thing or not? And the other margin you have is the capital adequacy ratio for banks. I think those are the kind of two kind of policy instruments you can use to limit the extent to which firms would borrow, you know, the kind of borrowing capacity and go more through equity financing. Now, the whole view is to say, can you really dispense with debt financing? And it's not totally clear because, you know, venture capital is, for example, venture capital is more like equity type of financing, but they themselves are very leveraged. You see what I mean? So if we had limited leverage a lot, would we have seen this kind of you know, explosion of venture capital in the US and countries? And that I think is an interesting question. To which extent you have substitutability or complementarity between debt and equity financing in that respect? And that I think is a very interesting question to be looked at. And I don't have an answer to that. I think those are challenging issues. Yeah. Yes.
I'm interested in foreign direct investment, and I just was wondering if you could talk briefly about the effects of counter-cyclical fiscal policy or pro-cyclical on the ability of countries to attract foreign direct investment.
But you could suppose, I mean, you could assume that it should create a more attractive environment for FDI. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to look at. Because it's true that no study I have seen on FDI looks at the link with how you manage the cycle. But you could imagine that, foreign firms operate, in the domestic environment. So of course, on the other hand, it's true that, well, it's not totally obvious because they compete with local firms. So if they can get their own financing, and they do, if anything that makes life harder for the local firms might encourage FDI. But on the other hand, you create more growth enhancing, you can sustain all kind of investment over the cycle. That would be, I think, encouraging for FDI. So you have partly a crowding out effect, but partly the fact that, FDI benefits from more, all what will create a more investment-friendly, would be improve the investment climate in the country. And what I'm arguing here is that the counter-cyclical policy improve the investment climate. But that would be very interesting to find out, that the latter effect dominates the former, and whether it does. So that would make that issue not totally trivial, but I think definitely relevant.
Just a couple of clarification points. The first one is about the regression of fiscal policy. I was wondering whether you actually use the cyclically adjusted measures of deficits.
Yes, we have, in fact. When I show all the columns, I didn't go in detail there. I was dividing by potential GDP instead of actual GDP because I wanted to control, I wanted to do the cyclical adjustment, and it's totally robust to that.
Okay, and the second question is about your results, actually. I mean, I was wondering, if you use as a dependent variable in the fiscal policy regressions the deficit primary balance of the government expenditure, you can actually capture the fact that the government raises, for example, public salaries during recessions, for example, as a consequence of more demanding trade unions. How can this affect, reduce aggregate volatility? Because your point is that the government expenditure, counter-cyclical policy can reduce volatility, which induces R&D investment. But if a government increases public salaries works, how can
in fact, I have gone, you're absolutely right, we've gone further, and I've looked at the composition of the deficit. You have government consumption, government investment, and transfers. It's really the government investment part which is the more important. You see what I mean? That seemed to be I had a thing on revenue. I did revenues and expenditure here. But in other work, I've looked at the composition between government investment. So I have a table I didn't show to you, but fiscal or other stories. Revenue expenditure. It seems that it's more the expenditure part than the revenue part of the fiscal that is more important. And when you decompose the expenditure part, it's more like the government investment which is the more important, which is the thing you would expect. Not so much the transfers. Sorry? No, I didn't look at particular. When I look at R&D, I did the R&D table where I look at, to the extent that it's good for R&D to have a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But I didn't look at being more counter-cyclical in that particular. I didn't say training support, R&D support, and that I didn't do yet. That's something we could do. To say not only investment, but investment in those guys. Because I would like to include those guys in the automatic stabilizers. That would be the case we would like to make. Automatic stabilizers is a good idea, but include growth-enhancing investment in them. And that I haven't done that part. Yeah. Yes.
Did you include in that regression a sort of measure of the public debt stock over GDP, for instance? I think that it could be an interesting control. Okay, there is a control in the auxiliary regression for the stock of public debt.
Yes, okay, I did it in this specification. You see here? You see the one at the bottom?
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then it's robust, and that is this table.
Okay.
Let me show you. Voila.
Okay, so in a sense, your major cyclical attitude of fiscal policies, control for fiscal discipline. Is that right? Is that the right interpretation?
Yes.
Okay.